Thank you for joining us on the Jim Bohannon Show. From the Dial Global Radio Networks, we're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. And online, we're at jimbotalk.net. Ah, yes, online. The subject of so much of our lives, good and bad. Now, federal prosecutors are referring to the biggest cybercrime case filed in American history. Late last week, they charged 5 men with hacking and credit card fraud, a spree that cost companies over $300 million. The companies hacked a Visa affiliate which processes transactions, the NASDAQ Stock Exchange, J.C. Penney, JetBlue Airlines. The 5 suspects, only 2 of which are in custody, are from Russia and Ukraine. Prosecutors estimate that they helped steal at least 160 million payment card numbers. They use sophisticated methods to bypass the antivirus software of their victims. The hackers were able to infiltrate computers to secure payment card numbers, which they then sold to others, who in turn sold them to fraudsters who encode the number onto blank plastic cards. Whoa! The factory they've got going here. Let's talk more about this with software security specialist Keith Squires. He is the founder and the CEO at the Pathfinder Group, Pathmaker Group, online at pathmaker-group.com. Keith, good evening.
Good evening, Jim. How are you?
I'm somewhat dismayed, I suppose, by all of this. They use sophisticated methods to bypass the antivirus software of their victims. These are pretty good-sized victims. I would assume that NASDAQ and J.C. Penney and JetBlue are able to afford pretty fair protection in this regard, which is another way of saying if they can have their protections bypassed, who among us would be immune?
Exactly. Well, and unfortunately, all those companies include one common denominator, and that is people. And some people think that the people in the companies are the greatest vulnerability and the greatest flaw. So they did talk about sophisticated methods, but I will say, based on some of the reporting, that they're still using the same old-school methods to break in that they've been using for years. So not a lot new under the sun with this one.
All right. What were these methods?
The most common vulnerability practice out there is basically a malware, which means something gets planted inside your company's environment, and it can sit there and do all kinds of invasive things. It can sit there quietly for years and years, and nobody ever knows about it, and it's going about its business of looking for data and gathering data. The second most common is phishing, and something that's really common these days is called spear phishing, where they're going to target specific people, and they're going to take a lot of time and do a lot of research and find out enough about you so that when they send you that email, you get fooled into thinking it's a legitimate email. You click on links and visit a site, and boom, now they're in. They've infiltrated your computer and your company's network.
Mm-hmm. It would seem that there ought to be ways around this. I mean, really good, secure ways. I mean, unless you just know, for example, what a password is, how do people get around this sort of thing? It would seem to me that the procedures I have to go through, for example, here at work and elsewhere, are sufficient. That unless somebody's going to read my mind, I'm not quite sure how they pull this off.
Right. Well, the two most valuable practices are, first is identity and password management, and of course identity management is an area we focus on heavily, which is companies have to aggressively and assertively manage the identities in their environment. They have to know who's in there and that they've been legitimately accounted for. That's what all the compliance and audit regulation are about these days. And they provide tools to help users effectively manage passwords so that when they enforce password policies, it doesn't become unworkable. It's something where the company helps employees manage the frequency of changing the passwords and enforces the policy of how complex it has to be. So that's one of the most effective. The second most effective is just awareness training. You've got to let people know what these crazy phishing emails look like and why they shouldn't click on them and what the issues can be if they do. So those are by and large the two most popular, the two most valuable security practices, and they fall off from there. But, both of those involve people.
Some of the things I've seen over the years, I got a thing one time, as I recall, it was from Internal Revenue, which not really, but it looked really good, really good. And I was, and there was another one I got from a company with which I dealt. I forget what it was now, but it looked real. I even got out, in that case, I got out a bill statement and started comparing things on the email and on my bill statement. I mean, some of these are really, really good. I ultimately did not open that, which I discovered was, in fact, the right course of action. But I couldn't flatly say, well, I caught the bums. I wasn't sure.
Right. Well, when in doubt, my rule of thumb is always just go to the source. Don't bother with an email if you think there's a concern with, a financial institution or investment account or anything else.
We could try their toll-free number and get that representative who answers within 15 seconds. I mean, companies, to a great extent, invite this on the rest of us because we know perfectly well we can't go to the company and get any kind of reasonable answer.
You can go directly to their website and not click the link in the email. And believe me, I spend a fair amount of time. I've got 4 children, and and with all the computers we've got running around, you've got to be vigilant. So I educate them pretty heavily. When I find a good one, I show it to them, and I give them, tips on what they should do instead of clicking this thing. And it's a big problem in our society. Everybody's really connected. Everybody wants to be where they want to be quickly, and nobody wants to wait, and nobody wants to stop to learn and be educated. They kind of stick their head in the sand and go on about their business with their social media, and they don't want to be interrupted. And then they'll jump over from their social media to their banking site using the same ID and password, and bam, the bad guys have got you.
Yeah. Again, I don't know how many passwords. I was just thinking about this the other day. After my company said you must change your password, I was wondering how many passwords do I have now, and I think 4 or 5 that come quickly to mind. And it probably, I'll be perfectly honest with you, it probably should be more than that.
It can definitely get daunting. In fact, what we observe most of the time is employees have somewhere between 10 and 20 in most cases. And
10 and 20, wow.
Sure, and there are
you can't remember that many on which goes where. You have to have it written down.
Well, they end up using the same ID and similar passwords for sure. And there are technologies that can make safeguarding that a little more effective. There's technologies for single sign-on that are relatively secure, where you change passwords on the back end. The user only logs in once, and your credentials are locked away. So it'll do some logging in for you, but if the employee leaves, you can disable that, and you've disabled everything. So there are some ways to make it effective for both the company and the employee, but it takes some investment and some planning and thinking.
Yeah, I've found a way to come up with passwords for me that I can remember, and that I don't think anybody would ever figure out. But certainly it doesn't involve things like birthdays and that sort of nonsense. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. If J.C. Penney's and JetBlue Airlines, NASDAQ, big companies can be involved in this sort of hacking victimization, who among us is safe? 1-866-50-JIMBO. Back in a moment with Keith Squires, the founder of PathmakerGroup.com. There's a hyphen between Pathmaker and Group. We'll be right back. It's good of you to join us on the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO. This mega hacking case and credit card fraud spree is staggering. Robin calls in from Rochester, New York, to speak with our guest, Keith Squires of Pathmaker Group. Good evening, Robin. Welcome.
Yes, thank you for taking my call.
Mm-hmm.
My main question is, with the success of these hackers from hacking in and stealing all this money, is it still worth it for high-tech companies and federal agencies to hire their own hackers to prevent these hackers from, successfully stealing money?
Does that happen a great deal these days? You hear occasional stories of criminals who teach all of their tricks and go straight. Is that a common practice, Keith?
Sure. Well, I think those are in the media because they're kind of glamorous. But the fact is, there's experts at work all the time, hundreds and thousands of them, trying to get better and better and leapfrogging the hackers just to stay ahead. So, there's plenty of expert security guys out there doing things all the time to help. I think the bigger problem, and here's a scary statistic, Jim, 66% of all breaches take months or even years to discover, which is part of the problem that occurred with this big breach that they finally busted. But because companies aren't doing a great job of correlating information and really pulling all the pieces together, they don't know that they're being breached. Things will go on forever. Sometimes they don't even know they've been breached until the FBI shows up and lets them know.
So what the hackers tend to not get too greedy to tip off the victim?
That's it exactly. They can do a whole lot more. They can benefit themselves in greater ways by sitting there quietly looking around for data. And the key thing for large enterprises especially is security in layers. So if you look at any popular security standard, you've got security activities that need to go on multiple levels in multiple domains. We do an assessment where we cover 16 different domains, and that's a lot of ground to cover for any organization. And to try to keep that on the leading edge and current and coordinated when everyone's under increasing budget constraints and security seems to always get the short end of the stick from the people we talk to. It's a very daunting task, but one that needs to be addressed based on the risk that you can see is there based on these hackers. So there are great tools out there, and there are really smart people who can put them in place, but companies have to be willing, the business side and the security IT folks have to be willing to get together and make agreements on where the risk exposure is and where they should make the investments. They can do a better job of correlating events within the enterprise to identify breaches, but they have to put the investment in there.
Yeah. I mentioned a moment ago that if these big entities can be hacked, what chance do the rest of us have? On the other hand, the rest of us don't have the assets of a big company. Are individuals really that much of a target? I know that nobody is really safe from this sort of activity, but if, in fact, it's that easy to breach a company that has millions in sales or hundreds of millions in sales, they don't want to come after some schlump like me. I'm not worth the effort, probably.
Well, you wouldn't think so, but it still happens, and it'll wreck your life in a hurry if you're not careful. So, all the common sense rules apply. Same thing with phishing emails and securing a wireless network device in your home. You've got to, again, be educated and understand the technology. Don't adopt technology when you're not sure of its security. Talked earlier today on another station about people hacking into your home network, looking at your security cameras and some of these smart devices in your home. I mean, there's ways to get inside your home and create havoc, so you have to be careful as an individual just as much as companies do.
Something I've kind of wondered about, Wi-Fi signals. They tend to be circular, don't they, like a broadcast transmitter?
Well, they're all going to be limited in distance.
Limited in distance, yeah, but I'm simply saying that most properties are roughly rectangular in one way or another. We in broadcasting have a little thing known as a directional antenna. I'm wondering if Wi-Fi would be well advised to institute directional antennas so that, in fact, if there's a circle that surrounds your property, you can't just sit outside the street in a car on the curb and pick up my signal.
Yeah, I think you'd get into some issues with how big your home is and where you're going to be sitting on the couch. But
yeah,
I mean, the key thing with wireless is that you secure it. I mean, there's plenty of ways. You can put encryption on there for the signal and secure it easily. It's just some people don't bother to. In fact, they'll leave the default subsystem ID from the manufacturer, the default administrator and user ID and password, and anybody that wants in just types in what's out of the box, and boom, there you go.
It would be instructive, I imagine, for most of us who have Wi-Fi to just go outside their house to the nearest community area, like a sidewalk or a street, and just see if the signal reaches there. I suspect that most of us would find that it does, right?
Well, I think most of us can probably see if you have broadcasting on, which you can turn off. Can see all of our neighbors. Now they're so powerful, the signals are so powerful that you can see the signal being broadcast, but that's another thing you can disable so that people won't see the subsystem that's being broadcast.
Well, they won't see it, but in fact, is it not true that the signal's still there? You just don't know it?
You just have to know what the ID is.
I gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
I'm told that Wi-Fi tends to broadcast about 200 feet. So
that's pretty accurate. Yep.
Yeah. So in other words, if your house's property is substantially less than that, you're telling the whole neighborhood.
Sure, especially if you live in an apartment.
Yeah. All right. Well, another cheery thought to pass along to everybody here. What's the biggest mistake you run across in terms of? Let's start with businesses, first of all, as opposed to individuals. What's the biggest mistake businesses tend to make in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, one of the bigger ones that's really coming up on the radar now is not designing security into their applications. So they will develop code, put a website up, and, security is somewhat of an afterthought. One of the key things companies need to be thinking about is testing their applications. And obviously, if they test them at the end of developing it, it's very expensive. And if they find a breach, then it's extremely expensive because now they've got to pay for the breach. But if you test it when you're building it, you use good design principles, and then you test it when you build it, it's very inexpensive other than some tools that you have to utilize to make sure it sounds.
When I buy a system, in other words, have something installed, I would tend to assume that a reasonable amount of security is built into it. That's the same kind of assumption I make if I buy a car. I sort of assume that the axles and the gas tank are included. I really don't have to ask for those as extras. I would assume that in this sort of thing, I would assume a certain amount of security is included.
Sure, there's certainly certain certifications that you need to make sure have been applied to make sure that it's sound as well. Absolutely.
Well, anyway, I hope that there are lessons learned from all of this tonight. And again, our guest software security specialist, Keith Squires. He founded and heads up the Pathmaker Group online at pathmaker-group.com.